Hello and welcome back to the second Adjutant's Lounge of 2024. Today I am joined, as always, by Dr. Phil Blood. Hello, Dr. Phil Blood.
Hi, Ben, Biggles and Dustin.
Hello, Dustin. Hi. Kane, lawyer at large.
Liar?
Lawyer!
I said liar.
Now, it sounded like lawyer to me.
Well, no,
I was watching Blade 2 yesterday with my son, and Blade meets a bunch of vampires and a human. He says, "You're human." And the lawyer replies, "Barely, I'm a lawyer."
Blade is classic. Now, what we're doing today, I've already started to count down. We're doing 20 minutes.
Or trying to.
Okay. No, we're going to do it because we've all got work to do. We're all deep intellectuals and doing deep intellectual stuff. I'm considering possibly making a cup of tea after this or a coffee. I don't know. These things take time. I haven't got time to sit around chuntering about the world when coffee decisions need to be made. No pressure. So
non-alcoholic
beer, water, big mug of tea with scramble. So Phil, what's occurring?
Okay, so back on the theme of Germany in the Second World War in 1944, and specifically Aachen, because as we know, I'm writing that book, War Comes to Aachen. And I think the interesting thing about January 1944 are the 5 air raids, which, when you think about it, are quite and it's not so much interesting as focusing the mind, because it looks like nothing, because 40 people are dead, another 50 are wounded, and you think, well, what's that in the great scheme of things with the Royal Air Force? Because basically what they are all decoy raids. So as there's a main raid, say in Berlin, they'll send a couple of planes over Aachen, and what those decoys do is to draw out the Luftwaffe or the flak defences. A lot of the defences are on the railway lines, so if they know the direction of where the swarm of bombers is going, they'll redirect the trains immediately with the flak guns to literally fire above them as they're coming across. So the decoys are very important. But the interesting thing as such for me with these 5 raids is what you're beginning to see a lot more intensifying prior to the big raid in April. So if you like, we're on a run up. So they had a huge raid in December on Christmas Day in 1943, and Christmas Day in Germany is the 24th. There'd been a huge raid, and that caused no end of problems because they actually aimed, contrary to all the stories about the bombing of Aachen, they actually used the cathedral as the aiming point, which of course they missed because it's the Royal Air Force and it's precision bombing. But anyway, in these raids through January, one of the raids, they dropped bombs near the theatre area. And one bomb came down and everybody thought it was a dud. So all the air raid officials thought it was a dud. They called out the people from the Theaterstrasse air raid bunker, which has now been demolished. It's now bunker flat, it's apartments, completely forgotten. But as the people streamed out, the bomb went off, killed 25 immediately, and another 25 were very badly wounded. And that was the beginning of these extra long delayed action bombs, which was, as I say, the first time this happened. The Germans became very cautious about duds. And it's very interesting. You'll see pictures. They made a film in 1943 of duds being pulled in the street with just a bit of old rope and a tractor pulling them out of the rubble. Now they're a lot more cautious. And if they think there's a possibility that the dud is going to go off at some point, they literally clear the area. So that was the legacy of the Theaterstrasse. The only thing that the bombs did of any lasting memory for the Aachen community was a German author had specialized in writing local stories about the local dialect. So he'd used the local dialect to create this image of Aachen culture, and he'd been writing this stuff since the 19th century. He was born in 1857. And it's very interesting. He disappeared, and his books seem to have disappeared. I've tried to find them. There's a couple in the university library, but it's not very easy. And that speaks of what's actually happening with the destruction of Aachen. As we're now going into 44, the old city of pre-1939, the city that went to war, if you like, disappears in 1944. And you're not just seeing it in terms of the destruction of the buildings and the evacuation of 165,000 people, leaving behind only 5,000, but you're also seeing it in culture. And this author, I mean, okay, he was a very old man by that stage, and he's killed. But lots of that stuff, that the books that he was writing and the articles and things he would write and talk about, all of that vanished with him. And of course, when the city's reconstituted after the war, many of that old culture didn't quite make it, didn't quite return. Some of it in little corners. Bernard Pohl, who was the official Aachen historian in the 60s, tried to reconstruct an awful lot of what happened by writing a chronicle. Aachen has a chronicle which dates back to Charlemagne's time, and comes right the way up to present day, and they add to it. It's the university, the city historical association, and they keep it updated. And they last updated it, I think, for 2000. So there is this kind of record of the past, but actually the city has been completely and utterly destroyed and then reconstituted. And that reconstituted city, however hard people try to imagine that's Aachen, it's not Aachen. And so what you're seeing in January is the beginning of dismantling of that city, and it becomes something else. Now, that's very rare in German cities, because you think, well, the people in Berlin, a lot were evacuated, but a large part of the population was occupied by the Russians. And then when the Allied powers came in, the city was divided and the two communities became more and more separated. The problem with Aachen is all the population, virtually all of the population, 165,000 people, are evacuated. Now, the interesting fact here is, at this stage, in January 1944, the local municipality were actually discussing what they were going to be doing with people because of the large dehousing that had been going on from the previous year's bombing. I think I've discussed elsewhere the July 1943 arson fire raid, which caused no end of destruction in the city. And a large number of housings were destroyed. I think in one go, there was about 15 to 20,000 households, which is probably around about 80,000 people suffered some form of dehousing. They made up for that through the year, primarily by using the bunkers. Now, here's the thing that people hadn't been aware of. These bunkers were housing up to 75,000 people. So you see the sheer size of them. They're not only occupying maybe 5,000 to 10,000 people going into a bunker, but some cases these people are staying in them. And after the war, when they start bringing people back into the community, they start using the bunkers as housing. And the last bunkers, those ones that are built in 1943-44, are still in operation in 1955, and the last locals are removed and given housing. But you can see the extent then of the housing problem, and you can see that happening now in January 1944. Essentially, the dismantling of the whole of the city, and the scale that we're talking about. The only way you can either contemplate it is what's happened in Mariupol, where the Russian army attacked Ukraine and the city was completely and utterly devastated. Well, you're seeing the same situation occurring in Aachen, but it appears to take longer, because it starts in obviously it starts in 43 when 28,000 people were evacuated, but actually it's very rapid. And as we'll discover later in the months to come, there's a mass evacuation in September 44, just before the Americans arrive. And that kind of adds to the change. And then, of course, with the fighting, then the city is finally destroyed. But you're actually seeing the destruction and dismantling of a city very slowly and gradually. And what I'm going to be calling this in the book is we're in a period of what I would call the paralyzed city.
Cool.
And the context is, if you read many of the books that have been written by people like Grayling and others, they talk about dead cities. Interestingly, if you read the combat reports of the American Army and the military government in later 44, early 45, you see them talking about the dead city, or Aachen is a dead city, or the variations of deadness. What people don't realize is the British managed to collect loads of the municipal archives and began translating them for the British Bombing Survey. Now, the British Bombing Survey in itself is a contentious issue, but if you wipe all that away and you have a look at what people were saying in these reports, the municipality was holding local council meetings after the air raids to discuss the damage so that they could obviously put in a claim from the War Damage Association to bring money back into the community and rework industries, especially those industries with government contracts and war contracts. But what they're saying when they hold their meetings is Aachen is this level of paralyzed. And it's very interesting that the levels of paralysis that the city goes through gradually gets worse. So we're going now towards the big raids in April 1944, which in the local community's view was the moment when the city was destroyed. But we know from previous raids that it was actually a process. So January is a very interesting point because it's like the end, it's the beginning of the end of the old pre-1939 city and that pre-1939 community, which is an important part of the book that I'm writing at the moment. Now, on the Eastern Front, while all of this is going on in Aachen, my alter ego, Erich von den Bach-Zelewski, was given command on January the 14th, 1944 by Hitler to send an action group into Kovel and defend the siege of the city from the Red Army. And the interesting thing about this action group, Stoßgruppe von dem Bach, is the fact that he uses his SS name. Round about 1938, Bach-Zelewski decides that his name is too Jewish.
And Polish.
And Polish. So he gets rid of the Zelewski. But what he doesn't say, which what he says in his report to Heinrich Himmler, is he doesn't want the name Zelewski anymore because Zelewski, his uncle, von Zelewski, had been in the colonies and his unit had been completely wiped out by the Maji tribe in about 1890 or something. Anyway, that aside, the original von Zelewski became the Custer of the German army and was a laughingstock. So Bach-Zelewski throughout his life has this horror, and he's tried every form of derivation to try and get rid of change his name. So he had von den Bach-Zelewski, Bach-Zelewski, blah, blah, blah. So now he gets rid of Zelewski and he becomes von dem Bach. Now, the interesting thing is he very quickly remembers his Jewish and Polish roots come 1945 when he's captured by the Americans, and all his name comes back. So I use in the book, Hitler's Bandit Hunters, Erich von dem Bach-Zelewski. But at this point, he is good guy SS man von dem Bach. And he goes in there with some of the SS elite. Chap called Gustav Lombard becomes his chief of staff. He has a cavalry regiment supporting him, but mostly, and this is the point of Kovel, which is going to become interesting later, you see the commander going in with his staff, with all the troops to defend the city. And this becomes the feature of the policy of Hitler's, which is you defend to the end and you defend a city. And it's a city policy. It's not a rural policy. It's not like, oh, you got to defend the hill to the last one. It's purely a city policy. And it's the Nazi credo is that the city will be defended and the commander will be in that city and defend it. Now, the relevance here is you're seeing it happen now in January 1944. It will happen in October 1944 when the commander of the Volksgrenadier Division, which is defending Aachen, he lodges himself in the city and defends it. So here in January 1944, when you're looking at the war and how it's going to progress, you see the roots of what's going to happen now. Bach-Zelewski fights the siege quite effectively, although he has the upsetting moment of his personal Fiesler Storch is crashed on landing, and the poor pilot has to tell him he's not got an aeroplane anymore, which is scary stuff when you suffer from serious bouts of hemorrhoids and you have to be rushed to the hospital to have your hemorrhoids removed manually. So,
the master race.
So it's all a bit of a bum deal for Bach-Zelewski at the moment. Anyway, the fighting goes on for quite a while, but the interesting thing about the fighting is he's also given direct support by the SS Luftwaffe group. Now, the 7th group are actually airmen and aircrew aircraft that form a kind of camp group, kind of support group, kind of transport group for supporting purely SS operations. Bach-Zelewski uses them when he's in the field fighting partisans, and what happens there is he gets resupplied with Stukas pulling gliders full of gear, and they drop into the lines to keep the fighting sustained. And it's the best way to keep those kind of operations going. They use the same thing here, and he carries on fighting quite successfully, although I'm not greatly impressed with the Russian performance. I think the Russians probe but don't really fight. Bach-Zelewski says they're fighting, but they carry on till the 11th of March. And then on the 11th of March 1944, Bach-Zelewski is relieved. He's given a token medal, and the 5th SS Panzer Division Viking marches in and takes over the city. And that's the end of my little piece for today.
1 minute, 31 seconds left. I've got nothing to say. I'm still writing. I'm still writing about planes. I'm still researching weird stuff and finding really weird things in archives. But I can't say any more because that would ruin the surprise. Dustin, you got anything?
Was that a Kampfgruppe around Kovel?
It was.
So called it.
The thing is, it's one of those mixed formations of all sorts of odds and ends. It's mostly army troops. It's actually the army artillery and self-propelled guns which do the most fighting. There's a cavalry regiment, SS cavalry regiment there, but you know you've got to be wary with the SS cavalry regiments because they're excellent at killing people, especially civilians and Jews running in the swamps. I'm not altogether sure that they're very good at doing anything much more than that. Anyway, yeah. So it's a. I think there was about 7,500 men. Maybe 14 Sturmgeschütz, and several battalions of artillery, making a regiment.
When the Germans start calling their battle formations after their commander?
That's quite a common thing in German military history. You can go all the way back and you can find that happening quite often. Probably one of the most famous ones is von Schill. But in the German army, you see it occurring as early as, I think, 1939. Isn't there several units in Poland called after the names of certain individuals?
You'd know more about that.
I think so. I think you'll find it's quite common at that time. It's not an unusual feature anyway of causing things after generals' names or colonels. Mostly colonels, aren't they?
Yeah, so there was a discussion on Twitter about 2 years ago about Kampfgruppe being a symbol of Germany's military degradation.
I wouldn't wholly agree with that. What you do is, with a Kampfgruppe, you put together rapidly a whole series of disconnected units that would normally not fight in that form, to make a rapid decision in combat. So one might be for an offensive operation with combat engineers and tanks from different units being drawn together to do an offensive operation. It could be a Kampfgruppe like the one that Baksalevsky is involved with, where they're to hold the siege for the city. It could be like Rink's operations in Aachen when he breaks into the city with just 500 men. There's no specific form. It could be you go to the colonies and you see Kampfgruppes. It's just a group of fighting men in a form which would not normally fight in that way. Cavalry, infantry, maybe artillery being applied to do a certain task. It's task orientated.
Yeah, I mentioned at that time that the US Army and British Army were doing the same as they were invading Germany.
Yeah, I think if you look, that's not where you see the decline of the fighting power of the military formations. Where you find the decline of the Germans is in when you compare doctrine. If you look at the doctrine of the Germans fighting individually against the doctrine of the Americans or the British or even the Russians, you see that much of the doctrine hasn't changed in 4 years. So they're actually fighting to old ways. There's been no sophisticated thinking. So if you look at what happens on the Western Front, many of the units are fighting with a doctrine that they've developed in Russia, which is totally inappropriate for fighting a highly mechanized, highly mobilized, and highly reliant on aerial warfare as in the West. And that's why a lot of the times the Germans come unstuck, because their combat doctrine is so entrenched on the Eastern Front style of fighting, they don't change that for fighting in the West. So you get these crazy guys doing these wild charges and all getting shot to pieces.
Well then.
That was 23 minutes and 55 seconds.
Not bad, not bad. Do better.
Are we drawing a line?
I think so. We promised we would keep it short and punchy, and I think we should carry on doing so.
Okay. Bit disappointed there was no questions about Aachen, but then, you know, my little city.
It was destroyed.
It was destroyed.
It was destroyed.
You're evil. You really are.
And on that joyous note, where we sort of say, yeah, we're not going to ask you a question about Aachen because it was levelled. Rightly pointed out by our learned friend in the corner there. Dr. Phil, thank you very much indeed. Dustin,
bye from the tunnel.
Yes, from your underground lair. Dustin, is that you snowboarding, Dustin, by the way?
No, it's a Ukrainian.
I was Ukraine. I wasn't sure whether you decided to do a bit of snowboarding in Dudar. What's the word?
Ukraine.
Yeah,
I'm going to Bakhmut to snowboard around there.
Cool. Got no snowboarding around here. Right. So for me, TCFN.
Bye, guys. TTFN.